For the record, please state your full name.
My name is Donald Dyer.
And what year were you born?
February 28th, 1934.
And what's the earliest memory you have of your parents?
3 years old. And that wasn't my parents at the time, although I thought it was.
And why did you think they were?
Because that's the earliest I remember, and it's the only people I knew at that time that was taking care of me.
Okay. And how did you find out that they weren't your parents?
Well, when I was 3 years old, it was in the spring. Let's see, that would have been about 1937, I guess it was. At any rate, I was with my mom and dad, or who I thought was my mom and dad, in a church out in Waco. And I think it was a Wednesday night service. Yes, it was. And somebody came in and whispered something in my mom's ear, and she said we had to go, and we got up and left and went back to what was her mom and dad, which I thought was, or her mom, which I thought was my grandmother at the time's house. And here these people were there, and they were talking in the other room, and then they come in and said I had to go with them, and I asked them why, and they said because that was my real mom. She had come to get me. And that's the first time I realized that the people I was living with wasn't my mom and dad. So they packed up my bags, and they were there in an old pickup truck, and we started back to Cincinnati from Canton. And it was a lot of rain at that time, and there was a lot of floods. I remember very vividly. It was at nighttime. We were driving all night, and I had to we had to make a lot of detours. And back then there weren't any freeways. We got back to Cincinnati, and it was just getting close to daybreak. It was still dark out, and we pulled into this old farmhouse, and we went in, and they introduced me to some people. It was my aunts and uncles. It was my mom's sister and their husbands, and brother and his wife. And they said that they took me in a room and put me to bed, but I couldn't sleep because I was scared, and I could hear them talking in the other room, and I heard somebody come in, and I heard him say that Don's back with us, and he said, "Where is he?" He said, "He's in your bed." He said, "Well, he's going to have to throw his ass out of there because I want to go to bed. I'm tired. I've been working all night." And I thought, oh God, what now? They're going to put me outside? I mean, you know, I didn't know. But at any rate, he never did come in there. He went to sleep someplace else. And I woke up the next morning, and they introduced me to my brother and sister, which I didn't even know I had a brother and sister. My brother was about a little better than a year older than me, and my sister's a little better than a year younger than me. So I was the middle one. And that's the earliest I remember. And outside of just being raised in that farmhouse, not raised, but living there for a while, I had no idea exactly. I can't recall what happened in the next little bit of time, except to say that my sister and my brother and I were always left with somebody else, either one of her relatives or strangers or whatever the case may be. Because after the war started, they started rationing everything. You had these rationing books, and you had to have a rationing book. You could only buy so much sugar and so much milk and so much butter and so much gasoline. And if you needed tires for your car, you're only allowed one set a year. And back then, tires didn't last like they do now. So whoever took us, they took us just to get the rationing books, because that would, in the rationing book went with the person, and that would give them extra stamps to buy extra gasoline and whatever they needed. So it wasn't like today where they pay you to take somebody. They just took the ration book for it. And there were several times where my sister and I were together, and my sister and I and my brother were together. And the next thing I can remember was probably, I think it was about 1939. Yeah, it would have to be. The war started in 41. So it was 1939 or 40 at any rate, because it was before the war started. And we lived in Cincinnati in an apartment building. It was an old apartment complex. It was just like 2 rooms. There was one bedroom and then a big kitchen room. And it was built with a courtyard in the middle, and we had outdoor toilets in the middle of town. But that was over in the old German section, what they called the Rhine section of Cincinnati. I guess today they'd call it the ghetto, but back then it was just the old section where poor people lived. And that's when we lived there, is when I remember I had an accident. I was up, we used to climb up on the, go up the hallways and climb out on the fire escapes and play. And one of the people that lived in the apartment was pretty good at modeling, and they made me a model duck out of wallpaper cleaner, which is like Play-Doh today. And I was walking it across the railing and didn't pay any attention and stepped through the thing, fell 3 floors down, hit the 2nd floor guardrail or fire escape going down, which helped break my fall. And the courtyard had a cement floor or yard, but we had a wagon that we pulled around, and it was happened to be, I just happened to fall into that instead of hitting the cement. So it knocked me out. Of course, I was out unconscious, and I remember waking up and having a bunch of people from the apartment building all standing around me, praying over me, and they gave my brother a nickel, I think it was. Yeah, it was a nickel then, to go call the ambulance at the payphone down the street at the store. And he was all excited, and he called the police department. I can remember this. And they came with a paddy wagon. And then they found out that they didn't need a paddy wagon to go to the hospital, but they put me in it anyway and took me to the hospital. And I guess I was lucky. All I had was a big knot on the back of behind my ear that made my ear stick out like crazy, and I used to laugh at me for about a month. That thing was like that. I didn't think it was ever going to go back. But everybody made fun of me because my ear was sticking out. But we must have lived in that apartment building for quite some time, because but we just moved into different apartments in the same building. And in the one place we lived on the 1st floor, there was an alley that ran beside it, and down at the end of that alley there was a bar. And the drunks used to come out that back door and down that alley all the time. And one summer night when it was really hot, our bed was right up against the window. We had a double bed, and me and my brother and sister, all 3 slept in the same bed. But my sister slept over against the window. And this sailor came out, and a couple of guys jumped him and killed him. They just beat him to death and everything else. But I remember that the blood splattered up through the window and then all over my sister, and she panicked. Of course, this was probably in 1940 or 41. No, it was 1940, because the war hadn't started yet. And she was just, well, she was a year younger than me, so I would have been 6. But it petrified her. Of course it did. And then across the alley, on the 2nd floor, this Jewish lady lived, and she raised her window up and started yelling at them. And they took off running, and she called the police. And of course there was all this racket and ambulances and lights going off and everything, so we didn't get much sleep that night. But I remember that as a very unusual incident. A lot of this stuff is just unusual incidents I remember. We moved to another apartment in the same building, but to the front. And there's a couple incidents I remember there. One, I had this friend of mine, I can remember his name like it was yesterday. Pete Hill was his name. And Pete and I were pretty good buddies. And he lived in an apartment down the street about 2 blocks away. And we used to go up in his attic and play. And this one day we were there when we were making paper hats out of newspapers. and we knew how to make boats and hats, and we would make them and paint them, and just for the fun of it. And it must have gotten pretty late. I didn't realize how late it was, but my sister came calling for me, and I told Pete, don't tell her I'm here, just tell her I'm not here. So he stuck his head out the window and said, he's not here. So we went ahead, and it must have been pretty late at night. I can't tell you exactly how late it was. I know it was pitch dark out. But I said to Pete, let's walk down to the corner store and get a popsicle or something. We had a nickel. You could get for a nickel, you could get a double popsicle, and then we could split it. And as we were walking down and walking past my house, I happened to look through the front window, and I saw all these cops in my house. And I thought, oh my God, what happened? So I walked in, and I remember the one cop, just like it was yesterday, turned around and said, is this the kid you're looking for? And here my mom thought something had happened to me, and she called the police. She said, yeah, that's him, and he's going to get it. And the cop said, well, he's just a kid, take it easy. Well, she didn't listen to him. I got it pretty bad for not reporting in. And back then, now the war had started, because I remember we were collecting, everybody collected, saved everything for the war effort. We collected newspapers and scrap metal and everything else, and they had these places set on the street corners where you, big boxes, crates that you dump the stuff in, and then they'd come around and pick it up. Well, we were bundling newspapers and storing them down in the basement of this apartment to take over to the place and dump them. And one day when we were out playing, I happened to look over at the door going into the basement, and I said to one of my friends, I said, you know, there's smoke coming out of there. We went down and looked, and the whole basement was on fire. All these newspapers, and there were storage bins down there. People had stuff stored in. But I mean, it was just blazing. And it was right over our apartment that we were living in. So I ran in the house, and I told my mom and my brother and sister to get out of the house. The place was on fire. My mom said, I thought the floor was getting hot. Anyway, they got out, and they called the fire department and everything, and they were talking to us, and there was 2 or 3 of us playing, I can't remember now. But we told them what happened. And don't you know, by golly, in the newspaper they said we started the fire. They said these 3 kids started the fire and then ran up and got help. And I was really angry about that. I remember that very distinctly. And my dad, my real dad, was never around much. He was an alcoholic. I mean, really bad alcoholic. And when he was around, he was mean and vicious and beat us all the time. And when we lived at this apartment then, one night, and it was late at night again, because we were in bed at that night, me and my brother and sister, there was a knock on the door. We weren't asleep, and it was my dad. He showed up, and that's the first time I met him. And when he came in, they introduced him as my dad, and I remember he brought us a big bag of conies. I love conies, and he had, wherever he was coming from, he bought us a big bag of conies. And he stuck around for, oh, I guess what might have been a month or 2, and then he just disappeared again. And we were glad he was gone then. When he first came, we were excited because we didn't realize, you know, what kind of life it would be with him.